The next topic will be, why is in vitro fertilization wrong? And we will have Father Tad start us off on that one as well. Let's welcome him to the stage.
So I want to start out with this question. If I was to just walk out onto the street and ask your typical person this question, what is IVF? What's the quick answer they would give you? Test tube babies. Absolutely. You know, this idea that we create human beings in glassware. Human beings in glassware. Now, I'm trying to shock you a little bit, and I can see I'm not doing a very good job of it. We've all gotten accustomed to this, unfortunately. But we should right away say to ourselves, human beings don't belong in glassware. And that's a good starting point for our discussion today. And I'm going to expand on that and look at some of the very significant violations that are a part and parcel of this. All right, in the whole world, how many babies do you think have been born using IVF? In other words, making test tube babies, how many have actually been born? Okay, I hear millions. Anybody want to choose a particular number? What do you think it might be? 5 million. Okay, that's a good number. Believe it or not, when you go back to the beginning, which was in 1978, till 2022, it appears that we are at about 12 million babies born. So that tells you something. That tells you this is kind of standard operating procedure in many ways, that this has become very mainstream, and we have an infertility industry here that is very, very well developed. One more question for you. Let's see if you have a sense of this. If you had to pick out which country, or which maybe two countries in the world, are doing IVF at the highest rates, what do you think it would be? In other words, doing the most cycles of IVF each year? Believe it or not, it's actually China and Japan. And they do more than twice as many as the US. So they have become, major players in this. All right, this is a picture of Louise Brown in the middle. She was born July 25th, 1978. She was the first test tube baby. So this is her mom who, received her into her womb after she had been created in glassware. That's her dad. Her mom is now deceased. And Louise has grown up and gotten married, and now she's had kids of her own. But she didn't have to do in vitro. She had kids the normal way. She's kind of a mini celebrity in the sense that whenever there's some anniversary from that date, then she gets interviewed, by the press about being the first test tube baby. So, do you know a couple that has tried to do IVF? Put up your hands if you know somebody who tried this. I mean, that's a lot of us. Now, those of you who put up your hands, put them up again if it was a Catholic, family that did this. Okay, yeah. I get the impression, I do informal polls like this, and I always get the impression that Catholics are probably doing it at a rate that's not significantly different from the non-Catholics. And I think that's a kind of clarion call to us that we need to get the word out. We need to share really the richness of our tradition here. And also, then save a lot of heartache, potentially. We'll talk about some of those aspects of heartache that arise after people do IVF. All right, so part of what we need to do is just look at what the technology involves. Sometimes it's like, well, this is just a way to get a baby, and let's not talk about the details too much. But when you talk about the details, you immediately begin to see There are concerns that arise. So the basic process involves first treating the woman with strong superovulatory drugs and basically pushing her ovaries to mature a bunch of eggs on the surface of her ovary. And then you use a very sharp transvaginal needle to aspirate or pull off these individual eggs here. They get pulled down this tube by vacuum, and they end up in this liquid, this special liquid, tissue culture medium it's called. And you try to get as many of these eggs as you can. So if you get a dozen eggs or 20 eggs, that's considered a good harvest. Up to 35% of women experience complications from that supraovulatory step. Increased ovarian cysts, they can have severe pelvic pain. This is called ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, where the ovaries kind of go into overdrive. Rupture of the ovaries is possible. Of course, infertility can follow, and stroke and death. So actually in Great Britain, there are at least 3 women that I know of who have just simply died from being superovulated. So it's not a risk-free proposal here. Once you have isolated, say, the dozen eggs, you put them into a petri dish and you fertilize them in vitro. And in vitro does mean in glass. It's Latin for glass. And so what happens is you produce a whole bunch of human embryos all at the same time. If you put 12 eggs in there, you're probably going to get 12 embryos. And if some of them twin, you may get, 13 or 14 that come out in the long run. So I just want to share with you a quick passage from an old embryology textbook, actually not that old. Their textbook back in 2001 put it so crisply. They said, although life is a continuous process, fertilization, the joining of sperm and egg, is a critical landmark because under ordinary circumstances, a new genetically distinct human organism is formed. And that's, of course, a scientific affirmation. It's not a statement about any kind of religious belief. It's just saying this is the biology. This is where each of us came from. So back to our diagram, you've got these human beings who have been engendered here, and they start to grow. 1 cell, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. Keep on dividing. And as they grow, you check them out. You look at them under the microscope and you give them a kind of grade. So you have a level 1 embryo here. That's a pretty good looking embryo. You can see the individual cells. They all look pretty healthy. We call them blastomeres. You have a level 2 embryo. It doesn't look quite as good. Some of the cells look like they're breaking down. And you look at a level 3 embryo and you say, oh wow, that embryo does not look very healthy at all. So the clinics that offer in vitro fertilization, which one of these 3 do you think they would prefer to choose to implant? Level 1, right. Now it's interesting, if you ask the clinic operators and you say, what happens if I take a level 3 embryo and implant him or her into a woman? They'll say, oh, well, many times you get a perfectly healthy baby because embryos are capable of fixing themselves. They're very plastic, we say. And so there's this kind of prejudice against embryos that look like this, even though they can, produce perfectly healthy babies. So what's going on in this step here? If you had to, use one word, there's a word here that fits where, we're doing this kind of grading and then we're saying, okay, you are the fair-haired child, you will be allowed to continue, but you, on the other hand, are not. What is that? Eugenics, good. Somebody said, yes, this is a form of eugenics. And I mention that because eugenic tendencies pop up with regularity in these assisted reproductive technologies. All right, this shows that some of the embryos that you collect, if they are not used for implantation, can be frozen. And they are put into these small tubes, micro Eppendorf tubes, and frozen in liquid nitrogen. So the insemination step would involve taking 3 to 5 of the best looking embryos, placing it into a catheter. The catheter is passed through the vagina into the uterus, and you release all 3 to 5 of them at the same time, and you hope that 1 or 2 will implant. And as you can see, if you implant more, if you release more, then you're going to increase the chance of getting twins, triplets, etc. I want to mention one other IVF-related technique. So this technique is used to do genetic screening. So what happens is after you've made your little embryo, here the embryo has grown to become 8 cells, and you approach it with this pipette and you pull off one of the 8 cells, and you see it in here, the blue, and then you do genetic testing. And you say, does this embryo have this propensity to develop this disease or that disease, etc. And if so, based on your data, then you would say, uh-oh, this embryo is not going to be implanted. We're either going to freeze him or her, or we're going to pour him down the sink, get rid of him. It's called PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and I have a video here of how it's actually done. And notice here, there's a little red spot. Watch this red spot at the beginning, because what they're doing, you see this is the whole embryo, and this is the outer layer of the embryo, and they're sort of burning a hole through this part so that they can then put the tube in and yank out that cell. So watch, it's very easy to follow. And that would be the blastomere that would be tested for various diseases. So you're basically pulling off 1/8 of the cell mass. Now you might say to yourself, gee, that seems like, it'd be like cutting off someone's arm. Seems like you'd be doing a lot of damage. And I think that this is a question that remains open. Embryos, again, can sort of fix themselves, but only to a point. And I think this raises questions ethically. Should you be pulling off that much of a human being's body mass just because you want to do some testing on them? There's an element of injustice that's implicit there. So this technique, PGD, is connected to the idea of designer babies. How? Because what you can do is, once you have an ability to test for certain features that might be desired, so let's say you want a baby with blue eyes, or you want a baby with other desirable features, well, so what do? You do IVF, you line up 10 or 15 babies in a row in the Petri dish, you test this one, you test the next one, test. Oh, here's the one that has blue eyes. We'll pluck him out of the lineup and we'll implant him. So that's how this technology can be used. So we have a video here that captures this. I call it "The Customer is Always Right," because this is becoming rapidly commercialized. If you offer families the option to test their kids ahead of time and sort of decide whether they want them or not, many couples, regrettably, will do this.
For every parent, their own baby, if they're blessed with children, is the most beautiful thing imaginable. But what about parents who might prefer one eye color over another, or like a specific hair color? Here's ABC's Gigi Stone.
Imagine if you could choose your baby's traits the same way you pick clothes from a catalog. Perhaps blue eyes, a bit of curly hair, or why not make her tall, lean, and smart? Dr. Jeffrey Steinberg says he can't promise you'll get the results you want, but can dramatically increase the chances. Dr. Steinberg has already helped thousands of couples choose their child's gender. Within 6 months, he says couples will be able to select the color of their newborn's eyes and hair. The procedure is called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD. It's been used for years to screen embryos in the lab, mostly for parents who want to reduce the chances of carrying a baby with life-threatening diseases. Now Dr. Steinberg says he has found a way to take this process one step further by implanting the embryos that give the genetic traits parents want. There are no laws prohibiting this brave new reproductive world, but ethicists say there should be. Some argue parents should not be allowed to play God. But if Dr. Steinberg makes good on his promise, this may turn out to be a reality they'll need to confront. Gigi Stone, ABC News, New York.
Okay, you notice also that there was mention that this can be used for sex selection. So if you prefer a boy or prefer a girl, you can do those tests as well. The customer is always right. All right, so with that quick overview of how these technologies are performed, I want to step into the moral and ethical difficulties here. And I want to start out by emphasizing that the intention of the couple is a good intention. I think we'd all agree with that, right? They just want to have a baby of their own flesh and blood. That's a good thing. But there's an issue here of how you're going about it. And the means turn out to be very important, that you must be attentive to how you're going about this. Now, this is a difficult area frankly, for priests to talk about. This particular issue, when I do talk with clergy about it, it's important to sort of give them some courage to bring it up. And I'll often say, maybe the sort of thing where you just mention it even in passing in a homily and then say, we've got some literature at the back of the church that you could pick up. At least so that your parishioners know that this is a matter of grave importance to the church. I have been asked on various occasions when I travel to maybe go into a parish and speak about this. I remember one time I was invited to speak at a parish in Chicago near Northwestern University. And the priest who invited me, he said, I want you to understand, there are people in the audience who've done this, but I want you to speak about in vitro fertilization. So I said, okay. And I gave a short, 8-minute kind of overview during Mass. And then afterwards, I was standing at the back door and greeting people as they were going out, shaking their hands. And they were saying, thank you, Father, nice homily, nice sermon. Thank you for coming today. But then at a certain point, this little old grandmotherly woman, she marched right up to me, looked up at me, and she said, Father, how can the church dare to tell me that my granddaughter, born by in vitro fertilization, is not a gift, is not a blessing? Powerful, emotional question. But notice also, very importantly, a trick question. Because the church never, ever says that. Every child who comes into the world, regardless of how he or she got here, is a gift and a blessing. Always. The problem is not with the child. The problem is with the choice made by mom and dad about their marital relationship, about their sexuality, but not about the child per se. So let me just explain this a little further, because when you have those kinds of powerful emotional questions that are being directed towards you, it can be a little bit unnerving. So let's think it through together. We can be conceived through many different kinds of acts. I think we'd all agree. For example, prostitution, rape, incest, fornication, in vitro fertilization, human cloning. All of these represent ways to bring new life into the world. Each act listed above is gravely unethical in different kinds of ways. So, the immorality of a particular way of conceiving a child tells us nothing about the dignity of that child. Children conceived by any of those means that we listed do not have lesser dignity than any other children. And just to kind of drive the point home a little bit with you, share this picture. This was from, 10 years ago when I was in France speaking. And I was visiting with some of the organizers of this conference. This woman here, her name is Rebecca Kissling. She's a lawyer. She was conceived in rape. And she travels around and she speaks about this. And she says, listen, just because my mom was raped, it doesn't mean that, abortion should be allowed, because I'm valuable, I'm important, I'm beautiful. And she, makes a very, very compelling case for this. So, likewise, we can say that the goodness of the child and the fact that he or she is a blessing doesn't tell you anything about the morality of the means which brought them into existence. So, the fact that Rebecca is here and, working as a lawyer, in no way, of course her existence is good and beautiful, but in no way does that allow for us to say, oh, well, therefore rape should be allowable, or is it good, or could be counseled, or could be tolerated. No, none of that. It does not follow. It is a non sequitur. Just because you are wonderful, it does not follow that the act that brought you into existence was wonderful. But that's the kind of error that gets made, and that's what the grandmother said about her granddaughter. Well, because my granddaughter is so wonderful, then that must mean that, IVF is good, and etc. So, it's important here to distinguish the way that we come into the world from the goodness that each of us possesses. Admittedly, God tolerates a lot of our poor choices, and he does his best to work around them and brings forth grace. So as we say, he writes straight on crooked lines, but it doesn't mean that we should try to say, well, then we need to make sure we keep our lines crooked. That's not what he wants. All right, so I want to share with you another story and use this as kind of a launch into just a bit of discussion about the ethics of IVF. And a couple of points from this story. So a number of years ago, I was speaking to a group of nurses in Michigan. Had a room with about close to 100 nurses. It was a talk on stem cell research. And after I finished the talk, one of the nurses came up to me and she said, Father, do you have a minute? I'd like to share my story with you. And I said, sure. And I don't know, you've probably had this experience sometimes where you meet somebody for the first time and maybe they have almost a certain simplicity or purity about them. Well, this woman definitely had that. And she said, so Father, the story I want to share with you is about in vitro fertilization. I said, oh, all right. And she said, so when I grew up in a Catholic family. And she made the air quotes like this, She said, what this meant was we never went to church, not even Christmas and Easter, and I had no catechism at all, but we were Catholic. And then I went off to college. And in college, I met the man of my dreams. We got married. We wanted to have kids right away. And we were trying. And here I was, young college-age student. And it became clear there was a problem. Couldn't get pregnant. So little by little, I started to share this with some of my friends, my girlfriends, some of my close family. And you know what, Father? They all said the same thing to me. They all said, oh, why don't you do in vitro fertilization? And she said, all my friends were Catholic as well. And I, being a young college student, I said, in vitro, what's that? She said, I didn't even know what it was. And then she said, when they started to tell me what this actually was, this idea that some guy was going to be making a bunch of my kids in this here petri dish, and then he was going to pick out which ones he would put inside me, I just knew this couldn't possibly be right. And when she shared that story with me, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, wow, that is a powerful reminder of what? The natural law. She had no Catholic formation at all on any of these issues, no real Catholic upbringing, and yet she could see, just out of a certain purity of conscience, no, this can't be right. This can't be right. So, and then, the fact that we have this natural law awareness of the wrongness of certain actions, she was able to be in tune with that. And I think the challenge in our day and age is that, with so many countervailing messages, we lose that simplicity, that kind of clarity of conscience. But secondly, she had the insight that the early human, as one of us, is a person with dignity. He's going to be picking out which one of my kids, he's going to put inside me. And her third insight, that there was this special vulnerability of early human life, which leads to domination over the powerless. You mean he's going to make the choice about which one of these poor, helpless, my own kids, he's going to put inside me? So powerful, powerful reminder to us. I always say to people, the whole area of medical ethics and bioethics, we can know it by the natural law. You don't need divine revelation in order to understand the wrongness of so many of all of these aspects of bioethics and medical ethics. However, I always say, thank God we have the church to remind us, to form our consciences, and to give us light and grace that we need, because it's so easy to go off the rails, isn't it? It really is. All right, so what I'm going to do is present 6 objections to in vitro fertilization. The first one is the big one, and we'll spend a little bit on it, and then I'm going to pass the baton to Molly, and she's going to share a little more of her journey, and then we'll do the remaining objections. So the first objection to in vitro fertilization would be that it undermines the meaning of sex. It says, in effect, that intimate sexual self-giving between spouses is not essential to the generation of new human life. IVF says it's okay to manufacture life in the lab as if it were a commodity. Production versus procreation. Just a quick word on that. Production is how you create Honda automobiles and Apple iPhones and, many wonderful things that we all enjoy every day. Production is a powerful thing. But it involves a very depersonalized dynamic, right? I sometimes use the example, if you're working for Apple Computer and you're making the next generation of iPhones, you're working in their super cool, lab, designing that next phone, and maybe you've got some circuit boards and you're putting them together and you solder something into place, and then you say, oh no, I just ruined the whole prototype. I shouldn't have put those 2 parts together. Well, what do? You take the prototype, you drop it in the trash, and you start over, and it's no big deal, right? It's totally impersonal kind of a reality. Versus procreation, which is something eminently personal. I like the word procreation. Pro, on behalf of creation. None of us have the power to create life, do we? But we have the ability on behalf of life, procreation, to work with the Lord God and pass on that beautiful gift of His. He allows us procreate, but we don't create. So that's a whole different dynamic, and that's deeply and intensely personal. That's a kind of complete self-giving, body to body, one to the other, that engenders then the new body of the child. And, here, when we say procreation and being intensely personal, I just use a simple example. Just think about your mom looking into your eyes for kind of an extended glance. What does she see? She sees something of herself in you, right? This is intensely personal. You can't be more personal than this, really. So there's something very sacred at root here. So human life is meant to be the fruit of conjugal love, not the result of raw, technical domination. I think we all sense this in our bones, in our marrow. I am meant to be loved into being. I'm a creature made for love. I'm not meant to be manipulated into being. We'll say more about that. Not the result of raw technical domination. All right, so the church has provided such helpful guidance here. And I want to mention one document in particular, this one, Donum Vitae, which means On the Gift of Life, from 1987. Cardinal Ratzinger likely had a heavy hand in drafting this, and it's a brilliant document. You have to read it kind of slow. It's sometimes very deep and dense. One of the lines there says, human procreation requires on the part of the spouses responsible collaboration with the fruitful love of God. All right, so notice here you have collaboration with the fruitful love of God. It's an invitation to recognize that God is the Lord of life, the giver of the gift, and we collaborate. And how do we collaborate? Through marital acts. I love the phrase, the marital act. It is that act which is uniquely privileged and reserved to the arena of marriage. It's an act that should never be engaged in any other setting whatsoever. The marital act. That is how we collaborate with God and that very fruitful love of His. IVF, as we see over here, he says, I'll take it from here. There's a temptation to arrogate to ourselves these rights over the transmission of life. So the second part of this passage from Donum Vitae, the gift of human life must be actualized in marriage through the specific and exclusive acts of husband and wife. That is the only setting, the only locus in which we can safeguard that gift. So to put it more simply, a human being has the right to be conceived under his or her mother's heart, in the safety of her body, under the loving embrace of his or her parents. Not under the bright lights of the laboratory, where these embryos, these young humans, can be manhandled, manipulated, flash frozen, tested for genetic desirability, ... Rather, in that nurturing safety of her body. All right, so what's happening? I mentioned we have millions of children who have been born this way, and the number appears to be, trending upwards still. Now, many of these kids are reaching, teens and older age, and they're reflecting on this, and they're expressing their own concerns about, hey, how did I come into the world? What's going on here? Was this right? Was this fair that I came in the world this way? And one place where this is particularly evident, and I think you would see this, all of us would see this right away, is when there is, for example, anonymous sperm donors. And these kids are saying, wait a minute, I don't even know who my dad is. How fair is that? Why did mom do that to me? I need to know who my dad is. My dad might have various, diseases that I'd like to know about, etc. And this seems so unfair. So anyway, this is one example of how people are writing and commenting on this. So one example here, a recent online article in Slate magazine entitled, "The Sperm Donor Kids Are Not Really All Right," includes some thought-provoking personal testimony from a British writer named Christine Whip, herself conceived by anonymous sperm donation. She expresses the feelings of some donor offspring that they are a, quote, freak of nature or a lab experiment. Those are her words. Those are pretty strong words. It's like, wait a minute, is this how I was supposed to be brought into existence? She goes on, "My existence owed almost nothing to the serendipitous nature of normal human reproduction, where babies are the natural progression of mutually fulfilling adult relationships, but rather represented a verbal contract, a financial transaction, and a cold clinical harnessing of medical technology." So I think that articulates it rather strikingly, and really should, again, call all of us to task to reflect, really, what are we allowing to unfold? All right, this is kind of cute. We've got this romantic candlelit dinner going on, and he reaches across the table, takes her hand, he says, "Honey, let's go home and make a baby." Kind of takes some of the romance out of it, doesn't it? But of course, the cartoonist here has a serious message, again, that this is not the proper way in which new life is meant to be engendered. All right, so I want to just ask you again to reflect on this with me, and I'm just going to ask you this question. When you have a couple that's struggling with infertility, and they make the decision that they are going to do IVF, they will often say to themselves, they'll have a certain justification that they'll use. What is the faulty premise that's in their thinking that they will sometimes articulate? They'll say, well, we're going to do IVF, and here's why. I'm entitled to a baby. Or what's the other way they sometimes say it? I mean, that's exactly right. I have a right to a baby, right? Child as a right versus child as a gift. So let me ask you a question. What happens if you force someone to give you a gift? It's not a gift in quite the same way, right? You've sort of upset the whole apple cart there. The notion of forcing a gift undermines the meaning of the gift. And we need to be, very attentive to that dynamic when we're talking about this. Because if we really believe the child is a gift, then we must petition the giver of the gift. And it means that there will be times when the gift will not be given. All right, this is a nice picture. You see the husband and wife looking out over the lake here. As you look at this picture, do you see anything else that's present? Somebody said a baby. Yeah, do you see a baby in there? You have to kind of look at the whole picture. Look over here. These are the feet. Here's the knees. This is the sucking his thumb. Here's the head of the baby. It's sort of in the tree. You have to look at it, and it pops out at you a little bit. I don't know who drew this picture, but I've always liked it. And it's a beautiful reminder to us how marital intimacy is the unique and privileged setting in which this gift of human life is meant to be transmitted. And, conversely, that we can say whenever husband and wife give themselves to each other, that act is meant to be open and disposed to the handing on of the gift of life. And that's why contraception is so disruptive to what marriage is actually about. So I often say to people, contraception and in vitro fertilization are two sides of the same coin, right? Why? Because what's contraception? Sex without babies. What's IVF? Babies without sex. So you see how once you've admitted this kind of flawed initial assumption about our sexuality, then the two go together hand in hand. All right, I want to share with you this passage and just reflect on it a little bit, because this is very important. This is from Professor William May. He wrote a bioethics textbook with this title. And he says, in talking about IVF, one readily sees how dehumanizing such production of human babies is. It obviously treats them as if they were products inferior to their producers and subject to quality controls, not persons equal in dignity to their parents. So isn't this true? I mean, products inferior to their producers. Just to give you one example, I think about this sometimes, how, well, let's just say I was visiting my sister, and let's say she had just had a baby, and imagine that I was holding the little baby by his arms, cute, beautiful little baby, and all of a sudden I dropped him into a vat of liquid nitrogen to flash freeze the baby. We'd all say, oh my goodness, how absolutely horrible. And of course it is horrible. And why? Because we understand that that baby is the same as you and me, and he deserves to be treated the same way as you and me. But when the baby is a little smaller, as an embryo, we're willing to flash freeze these embryos in large numbers, almost on an assembly line approach. So isn't it true that they're products inferior to their producers? And then subject to quality controls, you saw that when they were doing the grading of the embryos, not persons equal in dignity to their parents. So this is precisely where the wisdom of the church, where you might say the rubber meets the road, because the harsh reality is that when you do these technologies, subjugation enters in. You create the subclass, those little ones who can be frozen, who can be manhandled, who can be handed over to embryonic stem cell researchers to do experiments on them. You're treating them in a different way. This is precisely the core injustice. And it's also why the church says, look, it's so important to safeguard our origins. The way that all of us come into the world needs to be the same. We need to be loved into existence in marriage, in that beautiful covenant. Absolutely critical. All right, one more point here, which is that IVF is not a treatment for infertility. People talk about it as if it were. Now, why is it not a treatment? Well, the couple remains just as infertile after doing IVF as they were before doing the procedure. They still can't have kids. They're relying on somebody else to make their kids and implant them, but they remain equally infertile afterwards. At its core, in vitro fertilization is a distinct, non-sexual way of manufacturing offspring. And that really, again, stands at the core of the objectionability here. All right, so I'm going to hand the microphone over to Molly.
Thank you, Father Tad. So before entering this world of modern fertility medicine, I really didn't know anything about it. I knew that abortion was wrong. I knew that adoption was good. And I didn't really know much about all the options in between. So I realized I had to do some of my own research. So I did what everybody else does. I went and I started Googling. And I found just what felt like thousands of different ideas online, opinions and options in various clinics, and so much information. And I felt like that information was filled with a lot of contradictions. It was filled with false promises, and it didn't help me at all. I was very confused about where and how to start forming my own opinion. So, having been raised Catholic, I had always been taught to rely on the teachings of the Catholic Church when making a decision. And up until this point in my life, that had really served me well. So I started reading about the Catholic teachings about fertility intervention, and I was really surprised by what I found. So unlike sort of the firestorm of ideas swirling the internet, the Catholic Church offered a very specific and logical and concise set of guidelines. I also discovered that many of the options that my doctor's office was offering were actually fine in the eyes of the Catholic Church. So now that I had this information, we started working with the doctor. And as I mentioned before, we kind of shopped around and we looked for different opinions, and we met one Catholic doctor that we really liked, but because of the insurance that we had, it wasn't a realistic option for us. So we went with just sort of a mainstream doctor. And while we started working with him, through some testing, I was diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome, which simply put is a hormone imbalance that stops ovulation from happening. So the first recommendation that they made to us was to pursue IVF. So my husband and I went home and we thought about it and we prayed about it, and we decided that we weren't comfortable doing it. And really, we came up with 3 different reasons why, for us, it wasn't going to make sense. The first reason was that we really wanted to stay in line with what the church thought, because we felt like it was the moral right decision, and also because we felt like it provided us a moral compass to, or an anchor even to hold on to through this really emotionally charged journey. I didn't want to be making impulsive decisions or have a wishy-washy opinion. And I felt like out of all the information I saw, the teachings of the church sort of gave me an anchor point. So that was our first reason. The second reason is the more I researched IVF and figured out specifically what it was, it seemed to me like you entered into this area with a lot of potentially sticky situations. I didn't want to put myself in a position where I had to figure out what to do with extra embryos, because I wouldn't have known what to do. I didn't want to put myself into a situation where I had to, selectively reduce the number of children that I was pregnant with. So it seemed to us that avoiding IVF also meant avoiding some of those other sticky moral dilemmas. And then really the third reason that we decided not to do IVF goes back to the whole maternal desire that really was fueling this whole journey. Right back at the very beginning, I wanted to be a mom because I wanted to cherish life. I wanted to be a mom because I wanted to protect life. And the more I read about IVF, I realized that would oppose that natural maternal instinct that I had. So we took all of this information, we went back to our doctor, who again was not Catholic, and we told him all of this. And he was amazing. And he worked with us to try some different options. So Father Tad mentioned that there are some medicines that are available that help with this polycystic ovarian syndrome. So instead of IVF, I was able to simply take different medications that would help my body to do what it was supposed to do. The first one I tried was called Clomid, which is just like an oral pill that you take. The second medication I tried was called Gonal F, which is an injection that you actually give yourself. So, over the next many months and even years, with our doctor's help, we were able to try different combinations of these two medicines. And some of it was adjusting the doses, some of it was adjusting like the timing of how many consecutive days you would do each medicine. And it was a really long process. It was not cheap, it was not painless, it wasn't easy, but it did eventually work. So, in July of 2017, I was so filled with joy to welcome my daughter, Anna Teresa, into our family and into the world. And with her birth brought such a renewal of hope, and it brought this incredible sense of faith for my husband and I. And we really felt like we were proud of the decisions that we had made. And we felt like through our faithfulness to God and doing what we thought was right, he really proved his faithfulness to us. And I just can't even say it's amazing how this whole journey, I think, has really made me a better mother. And so it has renewed my trust really in God and his faithfulness through this whole process. So we ultimately were grateful for the decisions that we made to not do IVF. And again, I think I was very pleasantly surprised how many different options were available to me that still sort of fit my own personal moral code. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Molly. All right, so I do want to go through the remaining moral objections here. And one of the big ones that you might imagine, and which Molly alluded to, involves the frozen embryos. Because IVF treats human beings as objects rather than subjects, it ends up sanctioning the freezing of embryonic humans. And we have, an enormous number of frozen embryos just in the United States today. And it's tragic that this is an assembly line that continues to churn out human beings who are trapped in frozen orphanages. So I want to mention just a little bit of a legal angle here, because a lot of times people will say to me, well, what can be done? Because we talk about the wild west of infertility, and that means there's almost no regulation, and that's true. The only thing is, whatever makes money ends up being promoted here. Well, I always point out to people that in Germany, the Bundestag, back in 1990, passed the Embryo Protection Act, and it dealt with in vitro fertilization. Said anyone will be punished with up to 3 years imprisonment or a fine who attempts to produce more than 3 embryos at a time, all of which must be implanted into their mother. Or if they attempt within one treatment cycle to transfer more than 3 embryos into a woman, or they attempt to produce extra embryos beyond those to be transferred into the woman. So this is an amazing law. And you know what it means in terms of Germany? They basically don't have frozen embryos over there because of this law. And I say, well, if only we could pass something like that in the United States, because this would limit, if you will, collateral damage. And that's hugely important. We can all see that. Both Germany and Italy has a law similar to this, and in addition to the provisions I just listed, they forbid experimentation on embryos, genetic testing of embryos, and embryo cloning. So again, this is the kind of thing that can pass, in an advanced Western society if there's a determination to pass it. And I pray for the day when we have these kinds of embryo protection laws in our great country. All right, this was in the New York Times back in 2001. You can see the title of the article, "The Job at the Fertility Clinic Nobody Wants." What is that job? What do you think that job is? Embryo disposal. Two of you said it at the same time. Exactly. It's interesting. This article, when you read the article, it basically says that when the time comes to get rid of embryos and somebody is told, hey, you got to throw these embryos out, they're like, oh, me? Oh, no, I don't want to do that. And then he goes to another employee. Well, you do it. Oh, no, I don't want to do that. And so sometimes the owner of the clinic is the only one who will end up doing it because nobody else wants. And why not? Why don't they want to do it? Because they know that those frozen embryos, if they thaw them out, take them and implant them into, they're going to have beautiful, bubbly babies who are going to be born from that. So again, this whole notion that somehow embryos are, not really human, everybody who works in the clinics knows that's not the case. All right, the third objection to in vitro fertilization: IVF generally requires masturbation on the part of the man, which is always a violation of the gift of human sexuality. So here you might say, well, you don't have to do this. You could, for example, use a silastic sheath, it's called, which is a perforated condom with no spermicide. For example, if a couple's trying to figure out if there's a problem with his sperm, this would be a way during normal marital relations, some of the sample would be retained, some of it would pass through, the act would still remain open to the transmission of life. So you could do something similar here to avoid this step. But again, that typically doesn't happen. What actually happens is the couple goes to the fertility clinic and they say to the guy, please go to the back room where we have the dirty magazines and the dirty videos and provide us a sample. And so, this is one of the awkward parts of in vitro where we have to ask ourselves, is this really how we want the next generation to be getting started? I hope not. I pray not. All of this, as I mentioned earlier, is quickly commercialized. This was an advertisement from an in-flight magazine I took a few years back. And this company in Virginia, they do IVF. They also have donor eggs that are available. So if your eggs are not so good, you can acquire another person's eggs. And they actually will pay college students a lot of money to be super ovulated and donate if they have the right profile. If you're got 1600 on your SAT and you're athletic and you maybe have Jewish background and a few other desirable characteristics, they will sometimes pay $50,000 for one superovulatory cycle to get your eggs. So the quick commercialization here that has stepped in is very, very unfortunate. Because of course, $50,000, that's not a free donation at all. That is coercion. That's enough to skew my ethics, so to speak. All right, objection number 4. In vitro fertilization violates the exclusivity of the couple's marriage covenant, since they allow a third party, the lab tech, to impregnate the wife, albeit artificially, in the place of her husband. And, again, I think this is one we can all see. Marital intimacy is a very private, reserved arena. And suddenly you have this guy, the third party, stepping in and taking over the function of the father, taking over the function of the mother. in some ways, and violating that exclusivity. So again, this raises some other kind of awkward parts of in vitro, where we have to ask this question: who is actually making me pregnant? Is it my spouse? Is it my husband? Or is it some stranger who's doing this? Or perhaps a whole team of strangers who are making me pregnant? So violations of exclusivity. Now, once you've sort of admitted that this is allowable, it spins off in literally myriad directions. This is from Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. I used to work there as a researcher. They do fertility procedures. I was never, of course, in any part here. I was doing fundamental biological research, but I looked up some of these consent forms, and it's so interesting to see all the different options here. So you have insemination with anonymous donor sperm. You have a different form if it's with known intimate donor sperm, or with known non-intimate donor sperm. Then a protocol for freezing sperm. So you see how complex this gets, all the different permutations that, again, is part of the commercial also aspect of this. Objection number 5, the risk of multiplets. We alluded to this earlier. Turns out the U.S. has the world's highest rate of multiple births due to the spread of IVF. Because if you implant 3 to 5 embryos, you might get twins or triplets or quads, and then there's this temptation to engage in selective reductions. And that's just, to be very clear, this involves taking a large gauge needle, puncturing the heart of one of these babies, putting potassium chloride into the heart so that it seizes and stops, and that baby then dies, and his body is resorbed into the mother's body, but then the other 2 that are left over have a better chance of growing bigger and stronger. So sometimes you'll hear the criticism directed towards the church that, well, IVF is pro-life. IVF is about making new life. And you say you're pro-life as Catholics, and yet you say we can't do IVF? That doesn't make any sense. What gives? Well, of course, the truth of the matter is that IVF is not pro-life. It's actually a two-edged sword. And you see the death-dealing edge of the sword in selective reductions, in embryo disposal, and in myriad other ways along the path. So it is not authentically pro-life. And our final objection here: there's an elevated risk of birth defects in IVF children. The data on this are quite strong, and it's for a range of anomalies. So, for example, the probability of having your baby born with part of the stomach outside the gut space, or part of the bladder extrinsic to the body, it's roughly a 6 to 7-fold elevated risk for an IVF baby compared to a normally conceived baby. And for a range of other disorders as well, the stats clearly indicate this. And it's interesting because, as you pause and think about what IVF involves, there's a lot of handling of these embryos and doing things to them that are not in their natural environment. It's not surprising that there's a higher rate of these types of defects that manifest themselves. All right, so those are the 6 objections. I want to wrap up here, and then we'll take some Q&A and process some of these questions a little further. The executive summary, as I call it. It is against the proper order of human sexuality and contrary to the dignity of the child to substitute the marital act with acts like IVF. The Lord Jesus Christ reminds us through his church how every child has a God-given right to be brought into existence through an act of covenantal love between husband and wife. And children are so special and so important that we are called to respect and safeguard their most sacred origins. All right, so thank you very much. Thank you. And finally, we'd now like to open the floor to shorter speeches disguised as questions. No, hopefully not. Hopefully there'll be real questions.
Yes, we'll make sure of that. I do want to acknowledge a few folks before we open it up to questions. The National Catholic Bioethics Center, Ave Maria University, again, the Diocese of Venice, and certainly Catholic Medical Association as well, with another special thanks to Dr. Steve Hannon for putting all of this together with tremendous efforts. All right, let's open it up to questions. All the way in the back.
Thank you. My name is Scott Byer from Community Pregnancy Clinics. Question for Father. Could you speak to the reported or the supposed report of a synthetic womb that was created by scientists in June using stem cells? Are you familiar with that report?
With stem cells, no. I actually didn't hear that report. I have, of course, heard about the work that was done at the University of Pennsylvania, where they were developing womb-like entities for lambs. They were able to take a lamb out of pregnant sheep and transfer it into this device that they were then able to continue the gestation. So I know those efforts are afoot, but I have not heard of the one you're mentioning specifically made out of stem cells. So I'll have to double check on that. Some on the left here.
All the way in the back.
Thank you very much. I have kind of two questions. So first off, regarding like all the, I assume maybe millions of like embryos that are in that frozen, unjust state, like what can be done about them? And maybe like an example, I guess, would it be immoral maybe for heroic women to like take on some of these children that are almost like trapped, I guess? Would that be immoral? Or is it just the fertilization itself that's immoral?
Okay, great question. This is actually a kind of complicated question, but let me try to sort of cut to the chase on a couple of the points. So the first question is, what should be done with all the frozen embryos? And we all agree this is an ongoing humanitarian tragedy. So obviously the first thing is to pass laws so that the assembly line gets shut down. Because even if we come up with some kind of Band-Aid, little thing that we might be able to do to deal with a small number of these, it really wouldn't, palliate the problem in any significant way. But let's pretend that tomorrow Congress passed a law like they have in Italy and Germany, and now we have 1.5 million human beings trapped in these frozen orphanages. Is there anything we can do? Is there anything that's allowable? Well, obviously we can never use them for experiments. We can never give them over to stem cell researchers. Those would all be immoral options, immoral. You ask about embryo adoption. Could a woman maybe volunteer to be implanted with somebody else's embryo, with a stranger's embryo? So the Vatican, in a document, in its most recent bioethics document called Dignitas Personae, took this up. And they basically said, look, there are all kinds of problems with this proposal. And so they used, very cautionary language and said, this doesn't appear, to offer any treatment. or any resolution, and they said, especially for cases where couples might be doing it to try to treat infertility, it will always be wrong. So, what's behind this? I've done debates on this. I just did a debate, I don't know, a year ago in Denver, Colorado, at the national meeting of the Catholic Medical Association. And I defended the position together with Dr. John Haas, our former president, that it's always wrong to do embryo adoption. And a lot of people say, well, that seems weird. Why would it always be wrong? And I like to tell a little story that sort of clarifies my thinking on this, which is that, I one time was visiting with a family that had 5 kids on Cape Cod, where I mentioned I was a priest early in my priesthood. And when I was visiting with them, the dad asked me this question. He said, well, what about embryo adoption? And I sort of threw it back at him. And I said, well, how would you feel if Heidi, his wife, how would you feel if Heidi was implanted with somebody else's embryo? He kind of paused. He thought about it, and then he said, oh, she should get pregnant only through me. And I thought, yes, you have touched a vital nerve here. There is a kind of exclusivity that is written into our reproductive powers that is only meant to be borne out in marriage, and not, a woman is not just some kind of incubator that you can import extrinsic embryos. Granted, it's a horrible tragedy that all these embryos are trapped this way, but I'm convinced it's always an immoral step to do that. And the church, seems to be trending in that direction. The church has not come out and, declared absolutely definitively in every single case it's wrong, but it's used all this cautionary language. So then, to wrap up your question, so what can we do? And I mean, let's get really practical. I've had husbands and wives who did IVF with 7 leftover embryos or 10 leftover embryos, and they come to me and they say, Father, we made such a mistake. We repent of this. We've gone to confession. But what should we do with our frozen kids? We just don't know what to do. We feel awful about this. And I'll say to them, well, I don't believe there is any easy solution here. But I say to them, look, if I was in your situation, if I were a father of those embryos, at a minimum, what I would do is continue to pay for them to be frozen, because the freezing is a kind of protection. And I said I would even probably set up a small trust fund, if in case I die, so that they could continue to be cared for as a sign of my regret for having done this. And on the unlikely possibility that maybe in the future there will be some kind of solution that will come up here, I kind of doubt it. I think even artificial uteri, which you were starting to ask about, are not going to offer any kind of a real answer here. I don't think that you'll be able to use them as a complete substitute for gestation inside a woman. Think of how strange that would be, to come into the world completely through a machine, having never been inside a woman, inside a mother. I hope we never, get there, but I mean, it's looming large on the horizon. So, when I mention the trust fund, sometimes the families will say, oh, gee, how long do I have to do that for? I said, no, it's up to you. It's between you and God, but as a sign of your regret, I think this is, what I would counsel. And so I have counseled couples in that way in the past. So bottom line is, let me put it this way. There are certain choices that when we make them, they're so morally disordered and bad that we can't clean up the mess as much as we wish we could. I mean, just to give you a simple example, when somebody says, oh, I wish I could undo my abortion. There is no option like that. You've crossed a fundamental threshold. And I'm convinced that the frozen embryos represent a similar tragedy, a bad choice with no easy avenue out of the dilemma.
Thank you for that question. Another question? Got one back there? Okay. I see you up front. We'll get you next.
Thank you. Why has the church not emphasized adoption more in homilies and just in everything in light of the pro-life movement as well? And also, would it be considered selfish for an infertile couple to not adopt and to say, no, I want to continue through all the possible means to see if we can conceive, even if it takes years, to have our own biological children and never adopt? Is that seen as selfish?
Your question is, would it be selfish if a couple declined adoption and instead sort of stayed in the path of trying many different things? No, wouldn't be selfish. No. Listen, they're infertile. They're free to try, and I would encourage them to try as many different things as they discern with the Lord's grace that they should try. Give it a fair shot. Hopefully they can have kids of their own. So no, it's not selfish if they say, no, we're not going to adopt now, we're going to focus on this. And ultimately too, the whole decision about adoption is another area that I think one has to discern. I don't think it's some kind of automatic obligation for people who are infertile. It's not. Some people will remain infertile, will not adopt, and will express their fruitfulness in other ways, some of which, we alluded to as authentic, real, and beautiful modes of being fruitful. So that's how I would approach that, and I don't know if you want to say anything more.
Yeah, I like what you said about there being a need for the church to really promote adoption more. I know in our personal experience, during our time of infertility, my husband and I did meet with an adoption agency and learn about that. And one of the first things that we realized was that our health insurance covered a round of IVF for a $50 copay, but the adoption agency needed a $4,000 deposit to begin the home study process. So I think that's just one very realistic example of how that seems to me like a tangible change that could be made, whether it's the church or whoever, making adoption just a more easy avenue.
Great observation, yeah.
So don't make me put a 2-question limit on everybody. Next.
Hi, thank you. So during objection number 2, you mentioned silastic condoms. And so my question has to do with the moral object, because it seems that this is a situation in which some deal of wordplay is going on, because the moral object seems to be the collection of semen and not the marital union. And I believe that there are certain forms of assisted reproduction that are also condoned by the church that kind of take advantage of this similar type of thinking that, kind of like confusing the moral object here. So maybe if you could clarify this, and maybe I'm not defining the moral object correctly.
Yeah, so I mean, the question of whether a silastic sheath or a perforated condom with no spermicide, does it constitute in its essence a decision to countermand the orientation of self-giving that is written into spousal sexuality? I would say no, it doesn't. Now, in principle and at root, precisely because the act itself does remain open. Now, you might say, well, you're sequestering some of the sperm in the perforated condom, so it seems like you're lowering the threshold or lowering the possibility that a pregnancy could occur. That may or may not be true, but a lot of times this would be being done already in a situation where there had been a year of unimpeded marital relations and no pregnancy at all. And they're saying, well, we got to figure out, what's going on here. So there is no sense, I think, in which one could defensively say that it's really counter to the proper order of sexuality to do this. It's just to retain a little bit and to find out this important information, which information may in fact serve to ameliorate the situation by allowing for a new path forward if his sperm count is super low and there's something else that could be done to assist with that, then it would be allowable. Now, the second part of your question was, doesn't this sort of open the door to adjacent technologies where the sperm that is collected could be used in immoral ways? Possibly, but look, if you're going to go in those other directions, you may be just, ready to masturbate to provide samples as well. You may not see that as in other words, if the moral lines are not really relevant to you, but just getting pregnant, getting the baby, then I don't think that this sort of opens any sort of real line into something directly immoral. If anything, the willingness to be conscious about the use of the perforated condom and keeping it open to the transmission of life already bespeaks on your part a desire to know the moral line with clarity and to hold it firmly. And that's a good direction that we should encourage, I think. So, and I mean, maybe just to wrap up on the final thing, you may be wondering, are there technologies where sperm that would be collected could be used? And I'd have to say, there really aren't technologies for conceiving that would be allowable. There has been debate over intrauterine insemination, but if you read that document that I shared with you, Donum Vitae, it's pretty clear that that involves a substitution for the marital act. It's a collection of sperm, and then you inseminate the woman. It's not the marital act that is causal to the generation of new life. And it must be causal. That act must be causal in its propensity.
Thank you. We've got a question in the back.
Just segueing from that idea, if, for instance, a reproductive age woman is undergoing or about to undergo chemotherapy for cancer, and she has the idea of having some of her eggs harvested and frozen until after the chemotherapy, then having the egg reinserted and then having intercourse with her husband, would that be something that was permissible?
In short answer, yes. In the sense that if you could harvest the eggs and place one or maybe two into the fallopian tube after the cancer treatment was all done and so on, and she was back to normal, and then she had relations with her husband and the conception occurred the normal way, then the answer would be yes, that would not raise any fundamental moral problems. That technology exists, but is very rarely adverted to. In other words, what happens is women will freeze their eggs, and then they just say, well, let's just do IVF, which is, of course, a completely different beast, so to speak. But yes, that approach would be permissible.
Other questions? I'm impressed by the imaginative capabilities of the audience. Seeing no other questions, I'm content to adjourn. Thank you all very much. Again, thank you to our speakers. This wonderful job. And thank you to all the audience for being here and hanging in here until the very end.
Yes.
Wonderful participation, great questions. Really educational, I hope, for everyone. Thank you again, and thank you again to the sponsors.